This morning, I am going to tell you the story of Dr. Stephen Collins in his book, Discovering the City of Sodom. And I want to start by saying that I will not try to be at all biased in this, that I will be very biased in this discussion. I'm not going to attempt to be balanced between this view of where Sodom's located versus the traditional view. I'm just giving you the opinions of this book. I'm going to do my best to be accurate, but remember, I have no professional archaeological training. I've seen the border of the nation of Jordan with my own eyes, but I've never crossed it, so I've never been to the location that we'll be talking about. So just keep that in mind. Also remember, I'm condensing a very large book into a relatively short talk. So Lord willing, I'm going to be accurate in what I say, but I'm not always perfect with everything. Our story begins back in the year 1996. When I was 13 years old, the top movie in the box office was Independence Day, and Dr. Stephen Collins was in the midst of leading a 3-week archaeological study on the Holy Land. It was the morning when the group was getting ready to visit the location that was known as Sodom. And the location that was known as Sodom, we believe was located to the south or the southeast of the Dead Sea. Now, to illustrate how common it was to see Sodom as the south or southeastern part of the Dead Sea, I'm just going to go through a series of maps, and while maps don't usually translate well to PowerPoint, all of these maps are locating Sodom at the southern edge of the Dead Sea. So in map after map, you can see that if you look in various Bibles and places online, Sodom is always located underneath the Dead Sea at the bottom or right next to the Dead Sea, where you'll have Sodom and Gomorrah. And as Dr. Collins began his morning, as he was in the habit of doing on these tours, he read the biblical account of the place that they would visit that morning before meeting with his tour group. And in his reading of Genesis 13, in that moment where Lot looked upon Sodom and saw it to be well watered, Dr. Collins said he had a Eureka moment where he realized for the first time, I don't think we're at the right place. And it was based on the reading of Genesis 13. Kind of reminded me of one of my favorite scenes in the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark.
This is a warning not to disturb the Ark of the Covenant.
What about the height of the staff, though? Did Belloc get it off of here?
Yes, it is here. This was the old way. This means 6 kadam high.
About 72 inches.
Wait! And take back 1 kadam to honor the Hebrew God whose ark this is.
You said their headpiece only had markings on one side. Are you absolutely sure?
Belloc's staff is too long.
They're digging in the wrong place.
And that's what Dr. Collins realized. They were digging in the wrong place. That if Sodom was located in the traditional site where they believed it was, at the southern part of the Dead Sea, then that means Genesis 13 is wrong. And if Genesis 13 is right, then that means Sodom must be located somewhere else. And the reason is rather simple. In Genesis chapter 13, we read that Abram and Lot are in the area that was known as the spot between the cities of Bethel and Ai. And so it says that while they're at that location, Lot from a hillside is able to look upon the land of Sodom. And you know what you can't see from the hillsides of the area in Bethel and Ai? You cannot see the area that is south of the Dead Sea. It is just too far away. And then we read in Genesis 13 that Lot looks east, and then after separating from Abram, he travels to the east. But if Sodom was located here, where we have traditionally believed it is, that's not what Genesis 13 would say. If Genesis 13 was located down there, one, you would not read that Lot looked up and saw, because you couldn't see Sodom from that location. Also, if he traveled to Sodom, it would have said that he traveled down, or he traveled south. We have numerous places in the book of Genesis where it talks about someone traveling in that direction, and it is always referred to as traveling down, traveling south, but instead it says he travels east. But if Genesis 13 is correct, which means that Lot looked up, saw land to his east, and traveled there, and he was also going to a well-watered area, he would be going to this spot on the map. And so Dr. Collins, reading that, said, you know what, we need to figure out what's located there. So he began to dig into all the archaeological records of that location. And it turned out that, lo and behold, there were several large tells in that area that had never been investigated by an archaeological study before. So let's pause for a second and remind ourselves, what is a tell or a tall? A tell is a raised portion of earth that is raised not naturally, but it is raised as a result of people living in that spot generation after generation, and the ground is raised simply because of the results of the remains of previous generations, or you could say peoples that were living on that ground. So each era would get a little bit higher and a little bit higher and a little bit higher as a result of those who were living in that location. So Dr. Collins discovers these tells that had never been researched, and there's one very promising tell called Tel el-Hammam. So here's the location of Tel el-Hammam on Google Maps, if you can see it. And it's located right in that spot where, based on Genesis 13, Dr. Collins believes Sodom should be located. So Dr. Collins gathers a team together, and over the course of the next several years, the investigation into Tel el-Hammam begins. And the discoveries are just astonishing. The first thing that they discover about Tel el-Hammam is that, one, yes, it was populated during what is known as the Middle Bronze Era. Now, why is the Middle Bronze Era important? That was the era of the life of Abram, or Abraham. So we're talking 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. So we had a population that was living in that location at the time of Abraham. Second, not only was it a populated city on that tell, but the first thing they realized about that population is that the city that was living there in the time of Abraham, it was burned to the ground. It was burned by ash. The first thing they realize when they dig down to that layer in the Middle Bronze Era is not anything they can see or touch or unearth, but the first thing they discover is smell. They get down to that era, they get down to that spot, and the smell of smoke and ash immediately strikes them in the face when they get it. The entire area is burned. Some places the ash is 20 inches thick. So there was a large population on Tel el-Hammam that was present in the time of Abram. A massive fire burned the city to nothing but ash. And then the next interesting thing is that following the Middle Bronze Era, Tel el-Hammam was not populated for the next 700 years. So for 700 years, this tell is nothing but a barren ash-covered landscape, which is really significant because the area around there is very well watered. One of the reasons is that the banks of the Jordan will spill over during the rainy seasons. It will water the land around there. So it's lush. It is land that's still farmed to this very day. And Tel el-Hammam is this elevated area right next to it, making for a very important, strategic, logical place where it would make sense to build a city, a very highly defensible area, but no one lived there for 700 years. So the question is, what would keep people off that spot for 700 years? And then one more thing that the archaeologists didn't need to discover, but this was already known about this spot. Not only was Tal el-Hammam sitting next to a well-watered area in the Jordan Valley, but the city itself sits upon natural water springs, both hot springs and cold springs. So if you were living in the time of Abram and you wanted to find a place that was immune to the local famines, that was set up with a consistent water supply both by the Jordan River and by natural springs itself, Tal el-Hammam. And if you were standing in Bethel and Ai and you looked to the east, and we read this, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. That fits the area of Tal el-Hammam, a land which has a tell large enough to have a large city which was burned to the ground. There's also evidence that the city that was located on Tal el-Hammam was never conquered by an invading army. So whatever fire burned it was something that was not a result of man's destruction or an invader, but it was burned apparently by means that were not man-made, because they didn't leave behind clear evidence for that. And the other thing that they discovered about Tal el-Hammam was that it was not just any city, but Tal el-Hammam was huge. This city was approximately 10 times the size of the city of Jerusalem. The walls of the city were 12 feet thick and stood taller than a 3-story building. They even discovered the gates of the city, and so if this is Sodom, they found the gates under which Lot would have sat while he was living in that city. So Sodom, or Tel el-Hammam, would have stood tall and clear on its tell. There's also a smaller tell nearby that was also populated during that time, which was also burned to the ground along with Tal el-Hammam, which would have made an ideal location for the city of Gomorrah. So as Lot looked over the Jordan, what he would have seen during that time period, just looking out, he would have seen on the opposite side of the Jordan this perfect, well-watered valley with a large, massive city over it that would have been ideal for trading goods, for buying what he needs, and also to find walls to go into for defense in case of an opposing army. But there's one more thing about Tal el-Hammam, if it is Sodom, that is not mentioned in Scripture, which makes it even more ideal for the location. We've all seen pictures before of Stonehenge. Stonehenge, those ancient monuments consisting of what are known as stone dolmens. A stone dolmen is an ancient rock monument. We aren't positive why people built them. Our best guess is that they were for religious pilgrimages, so you would travel to the spot where these stone monuments were so that you could do your occultist religious ceremonies there. Well, Stonehenge is known worldwide. It is very large, but Stonehenge only consists of 80 stones when it was at its complete, full structure. Well, surrounding Sodom, or Tal el-Hammam, were also stone dolmens. These rocks aren't quite as large as Sodom, as Stonehenge, but what it lacked in size of individual rocks, it more than made up for in numbers. Sodom, or Tal el-Hammam's stone dolmens, surrounded both the city and the valley, and there were 1,500 stone monuments, 1,500. On the screen is a picture of Dr. Collin standing with the approximately 500 of them that remain today. Now, based on the evidence of what they found in that location, the belief is that the practices in Sodom, or Tal el-Hammam, wasn't different from the other Canaanite cities of that time. The sins of that location probably weren't any worse, but probably the key was that based on the discovery of all these monuments surrounding that area is two things. One, if you were to look at that location from a distance, the first thing that you would see is not the city, it's not the valley or the plains, or that it's well watered. The first thing you'd see is this 1,500 rock monuments surrounding them as sort of a calling sign to say, this is the central place for occultic worship. If you want to worship the gods, if you want to bow down before them, Sodom is the place to go. And so the belief is that a lot of the occult worship practices in Canaan probably originally started in Sodom and then moved into that location as the people in Canaan would have traveled to Sodom for their occultish worship practices. So this was probably the driver of sinful practices in Canaan. So everything about el-Hammam in its location, in its occultic worship practices, and in its destruction fits the record we have of the biblical city of Sodom. But there's one big issue to a lot of people that keep them from saying, there's no way Dr. Collins is right. And that is the dating of the destruction of Sodom. Due to the pottery discovered in the ashen layer of Sodom, Dr. Collins and his team estimates that Sodom was destroyed between the years 1650 to 1715 BC. So this is 3,650 to 3,750 years ago. And so that might not mean anything to you in that dates, but let's talk about what are the conservative understandings of the date of when Abraham lived. So the one date that most Bible scholars are relatively convinced on in Old Testament chronology is the date when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea with Moses. And that was the year 1446 BC. And we need to remember that when we're in BC, we're counting dates backwards in comparison to 80. So 1446 is closer to us than 1750 is. So we would take 1446 as our key date. So that's the date that we're going to be able to sort of track when Sodom was destroyed based on conservative estimates. So Sodom was destroyed, and then 1 year later, after Sodom was destroyed, Isaac was born. So we have the birth of Isaac 1 year after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, because if you remember in the biblical story when Abraham prays for Sodom's salvation, that's in the same time when the Lord comes to Abraham and said, "No, I come here next year, you'll have a baby boy." So Isaac is born 1 year after Sodom is destroyed. 60 years after that, Isaac has his first son, Jacob. Jacob travels down to Egypt to sojourn 130 years later. And then the traditional length of time that the Israelites sojourn in Egypt is 400 years. So we add all these dates together, and that gives us 591 years from the destruction of Sodom until the Israelites cross the Red Sea. So if you add 591 years to 1446, you get the year 2037 for the destruction of Sodom. So according to the suggested conservative Bible timeline, Sodom was destroyed 300 to 400 years before el-Hammam. And so there are some people like, just because of that chronology, we got to throw it out. It happened much too late. Or you could go the route of some progressive Christians who say, well, el-Hammam is Sodom, but it wasn't destroyed in Abraham's life. It's just an amazing event that took place during that time. And so the editors of the Bible wanted to attach that to Abraham's story. And so even though it really didn't happen then, they're just moving it into there. And I totally reject that one. Either it happened during Abraham's life and it's Sodom, or it's just another city that was destroyed. Well, here's my view about the dates, and some of you might not like it or never really talked about this, so we'll just see how you feel about it. My view is that I don't think we really know when anything happened in the Bible after the reigns of David and Saul. I think once we get to time periods before the reigns of David and Saul, I don't think we know what year things actually occurred. One of the reasons I feel this way is after reading a section of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I read some English translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls a few years ago, and there's this whole big, long section in them about dating. And the reason there's this long section in the Dead Sea Scrolls about dating was that the Essenes were arguing about when you should celebrate the Passover, so what date it occurred, and they had a few other dates that they're sort of debating about in the midst of these writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the reasons they have this controversy about the datings is that during the period of the Roman different calendars in the land of Egypt, in the land of Israel, excuse me. They have a Roman calendar, they have a couple of different Jewish calendars, and then there's another Persian calendar. And so they're talking about when things should be celebrated and when things happen, and it is just this confusing mess of dates. And I'll just be honest, after reading that, I came to the conclusion, we don't really know what year anything happened, because there wasn't any one set calendar to go on. This is why there's some controversy about what was the year Jesus was born and what was the year that Jesus died. Because when Jesus died, you would have had multiple people celebrating Passover on different dates because different people use different calendars. So that's why there's all this, what day did Jesus really die? What year did it really happen? Because we don't know what calendar the authors of the Gospels were using when they wrote the Gospel. So it is a little bit of a guessing game. So did the crossing of the Red Sea happen in the year 1446? I don't know. Throw a dart at a dartboard, maybe it's right. I'm not going to say that I believe that this then means that the world is millions of years old. I still believe it is relatively recent. But this means that I don't think we can tell what specific year we crossed the Red Sea, what specific year Abraham lived. I think that that is all information that we just don't have the information to know about. And we need to remember that when it comes to all of these dates, none of them are in the Bible. And I do think that there is a good argument to make that when it talks about the 400 years of the Israelites being in slavery in Egypt, that passage in the Bible, it's actually not referring to 400 years in Egypt, but it's referring to 400 years from when Abraham got to the Promised Land to the Red Sea. So that 400 years isn't just all in Egypt, but it's 400 years of Israelites in the entire Promised Land, of which the time in Egypt was probably a little over 200 years. And if you believe that theory, then that actually puts you right up next to the year 1750, which is when the city of Sodom could very well have been destroyed based on the pottery layer. So all of this is to say that some people will out of hand reject Dr. Collin's work because he will say that Sodom was destroyed 300 to 400 years before Abraham lived. And I'm here to say it's not that simple. We can't precisely date when this destruction took place, and I don't even think we can also precisely date when the Israelites went out of Egypt, when Abraham lived, because we just don't have a consistent calendar to track those dates. So in my opinion, that when you put together how Sodom was destroyed by its burning, by its location, by the date being approximately near when Abraham lived, I believe that that brings us all together to say el-Hammam is the city of Sodom. To me, there's just too much in favor of it to say there's discrepancies about the dates when the dates are the one thing that we don't have for us in the Scripture, when everything we actually have in the Bible lines up with Sodom. So I don't want to reject it for the one thing that we don't actually have in the Bible when all the things in the Bible align with it. So now to the million-dollar question. How was the city of Sodom destroyed? How was it that this happened? Well, the Bible records for us a couple of pieces of information. Genesis 19:24 says, "Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven." So we know Sodom was destroyed by a fiery rock substance of some sort coming out of heaven and coming down upon the city. And then we got a second piece of information in verses 27 and 28. "Now Abraham arose early in the morning and went to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace." So the land where Abraham was located during this time was the land of Hebron. And Hebron's a mountainous area that's sort of toward the south of Judah. And Hebron is a long ways away from el-Hammam. It is miles upon miles upon miles away. And so if we believe that's the location, then whatever caused that destruction would have had to cause a smoke pillar and cloud that would have been visible for probably a good 50 to 100 miles away. It would have had to have been absolutely massive. So we're looking for something that was fire from heaven resulting in a nearly supernatural smoke cloud as a result of that so that Abraham could see it in Hebron. So the question is, what could cause such devastation that was found on Tal el-Hammam that would line with Genesis 19? Well, the answer ended up being found in a few unique pieces of pottery that were discovered at Tal el-Hammam. That might not look that special, but that piece of pottery is actually rather stunning in its makeup. On one side of that piece of pottery, it is a very interesting green glass. On the other side, it is standard 4,000-year-old pottery that corresponds with all of the rest of the pottery that has been found in the ash layer of Tal el-Hammam. And so how the green side came to be is what is so fascinating. The green glass that is on that pottery is a substance that is known as trinitite. So then the question is, what is trinitite? Just out of curiosity, anybody hear of trinitite before? I had no idea what it was before I read the book. So good, I'm not the only idiot. Or just ignorant person, I should say. Trinitite is a special glass that is formed by the burning of temperatures that is so high that we had never made trinitite until the testing of nuclear bombs in the desert. It is known also as nuclear glass or atomic rock. When it was first discovered at Tal el-Hammam, there was an instant panic. They stopped all the digging. They had to figure out, did someone contaminate that site? But the other side of it was so obviously the pottery that was located there that they had to come to the conclusion this came from Tal el-Hammam. So the question was, how did nuclear glass arrive in the ash layer of Sodom? And this is probably I thought the funniest part of the book. Was Dr. Collins about to start an online conspiracy theory that the Egyptians had nuclear weapons and had nuked the city of Sodom? The other fascinating part of this pottery is that it didn't turn completely into trinitite. If it was heated by a nuclear blast, the entire piece of pottery would have just completely been that subject of nuclear glass. Instead, the one layer of it becomes trinitite, and then it is instantly cooled so that the opposite side of it is preserved. So a nuclear blast couldn't do this, and also we have no way of repeating this even today. We have no idea how this could happen. And so thorough research began to be put into by his team to try to figure out, how do you recreate this? And it turns out they found it, and I think it beautifully aligns with Genesis 19. They ended up finding it by researching into a 1908 meteor strike that hit Siberia. This 1908 meteor strike in Siberia is known as the largest asteroid impact that we have ever discovered in history. Thankfully, it happened in the wilderness of Siberia, where it was only forests that were destroyed, but 830 square miles of forest were left to nothing but toothpicks. An estimated 80 million trees were flattened. People in the nearest towns and villages reported having their windows blown out, people being thrown off their feet and collapsing to the ground. But the real intriguing thing was that for decades, no one knew what happened. No one knew what happened until the mid-1950s. The reason no one knew what happened was that they went to the central location of where this explosion happened, and there was no evidence of anything. There was no meteor strike on the earth. They had no idea what occurred until they discovered a meteorite phenomenon that occasionally occurs in the 1950s, and it's called an airburst. An airburst occurs when a meteorite strikes the earth, but just before it hits the land, it burns up on entry and explodes before it strikes the earth. The one that struck Siberia is believed to be 30 times as powerful as the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The one that struck Tal el-Hammam was probably about 1/10 of the size of the one that struck Siberia. And for reasons that I can't explain because I'm not a scientist, but this is what they say, is that when an airburst happens, it releases heat at such an extreme amount that it does two things at once. The heat goes out, but it's so fast and it's so strong that it also sucks in all the cold air that's surrounding it. So it creates this instant heat burst followed by this instant cool burst. And then when the two mix together, they create this gigantic tornado-looking smoke cloud that goes to the heavens and can be seen for hundreds of miles away. And when we read Genesis 19, it fits perfectly with an airburst. We have the brimstone that is coming from heaven in the clouds. It strikes the ground, leaving no impact of a meteor strike, and then results in a cloud that could be seen from Tal el-Hammam to Hebron. So my opinion is that at the time of Abraham, which is, I'm going to guess, I'll probably take a conservative middle ground date and probably say Abraham lived somewhere between 1800 and 1900 BC, that was also when Tal el-Hammam was destroyed. And I believe that this is the correct location for Sodom. Now, obviously, we could be wrong about this stuff, but everything lines up so perfectly with what we see recorded in Genesis 13 and Genesis 19. And it also reveals for us some important information about what was going on in Sodom, how it was a location of pilgrimage for people to travel to during that time for religious and cultist practices. And it really shows that there would have been this fiery destruction in that region, which would have led to a barrenness for 700 years to follow. So for me, this confirms that the destruction of Sodom did take place as it was described in the Bible. And what I think is the most fascinating thing about this is that if someone would have said to me before I read this, Shawn, what do you think is the Bible story that is least likely to be confirmed? I might have said the destruction of Sodom. Because we're talking about the destruction of a couple of cities by fires that seem to be overwhelming and thorough based upon the description of the Bible all these thousands of years ago. Who would have thought we would have had any evidence of that? And so to find such thorough evidence of it, and also the only reason they dug in Tal el-Hammam, you need to remember to begin with, is because Dr. Collins was reading his Bible. And he said, if Lot looked here, he would have looked at this spot, so we're going to dig there. And they dug there, and they found the city. So in my opinion, this is the location of the city of Sodom.